Welcome, everybody. My name is Randy Gregg. I'm the Executive Director of the Portland Parks Foundation. And welcome to Green Dreams. Thanks for attending and really welcome you here. It's a happy hour, so I hope you have your happy hour beverage of choice. And we're here with Vivek Shandas. I'm going to start with just a real quick screen share here. And for those of you who don't know much about the foundation, tell you a little bit about it. We're here to help people help parks. And we do that in lots of different ways, but primarily through partnerships and advocacy. We fiscally sponsor various groups, everybody from Friends of Brooklyn Park to we helped get Albina Vision off the ground. We hold Friends and Allies Summits twice a year to inspire and train people in fundraising and volunteer mobilization to help their local parks. And we give out small grants and annual Parks Champion Awards to groups and individuals. I see I misspelled individuals working with underserved communities and parts of the city in good parks work. We probably are best known for our work on the Barbara Walker Crossing. We initiated and oversaw the creation of the bridge to connect the iconic Wildwood Trail over the dangerous crossing on Burnside. And we rallied more than 900 individuals to provide over 60% of the $4 million it took to build that. We like to think of it as the first crowd-funded bridge Portland's ever had, maybe the world, we don't know. We've been winning a bunch of awards, and actually I just got news today, we're on the cover of Steel Construction, Modern Steel Construction magazine. So I never thought I would see that. So, very proud of the work that we did on this. And then most recently, we played a major role in passing the Parks Levy, which is providing Portland Parks and Recreation $48 million a year for the next 5 years. We helped get the campaign off the ground, and we're an essential partner to that effort. So thanks to all of you who voted for it. And even if you didn't vote for it, thanks for your tax contributions. So we are here tonight with one of the programs that we do is our Green Dreams series, which is an occasional and we hope more regular series of bringing thought leaders about parks to the fore. Tonight, we're with Professor Vivek Shandas, who specializes in developing strategies to address the implications of climate change on cities. His teaching and research examines where climate-induced events meet governance processes and planning mechanisms. But what Vivek really does is he looks at the long-term impacts, both historic and what's likely to come, of how to repurpose an old Winston Churchill saw, how we shape our climate and then our climate shapes us in the form of cities. And he really takes it down to a neighborhood level to really understand the impacts. He serves as the research director for PSU's Institute for Sustainable Solutions, where he works on cross-disciplinary efforts to address pressing challenges and facing communities around the world. And as the founder and director of the Sustainable Urban Places Research, he evaluates the environmental stresses on human health and develops tools to guide the growth of urban regions. But Vivek also gets involved in this work. He currently chairs the Urban Forestry Commission, where he gets to see the give and take between ideas and policies actually happen, where the so-called rubber meets the road. So please join me in welcoming Vivek Shandas. Here's to you, Vivek.
Wonderful, thanks, Randy. Thanks all. I see a lot of familiar faces, or see a lot of familiar names. I love to be together with you in a barbecue or something like that, where we could all get together and actually talk about this. But no, let's not do that for the next several months. Let's actually hold off and do this via Zoom. I'm going to share my screen here. Randy, okay if I kind of jump in with a little monologue here for a bit?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. So Randy introduced me as professor and director founder and chair, and I'm going to introduce myself as a Southeast Portland resident. I'm kind of doing that because this is happy hour. I get to speak how I get to speak. I'm off the clock, and I hope I can just be frank and honest and open with you in a few minutes here about things that I'm observing, things that I would love to have a conversation with you all about the city that I love, city that I spend a lot of time in, and city that I think has a tremendous opportunity, not only with the things that Randy had brought up with the achievements of the Portland Parks Foundation, though with all of the communities that are directly involved in some of this work in terms of creating a more equitable city and the role that nature plays. I'm calling this radical love in part because I really am coming down to more and more believing that radical love is the fundamental basis of human existence, if not to be too existential about this. But when I really sit with this for a little bit, all of the day-to-day mechanics of what we do all the time just seem like they're dressing on top of what we're ultimately and fundamentally trying to achieve. And that is to create a loving environment for all of us to be able to work together. And so, not to get too profound with it, but I do want to kind of break it down to some nuts and bolts today and just offer you some thoughts that I've been stewing on. And I'd love your feedback on it. This is work in progress, as we all are. And I'd really like to um, put this out there in Randy's invitation to come in and kind of share this in terms of where I am in some of this thinking of radical love and what it means to me. Though before I do that, I recognize that that many of you may not know me. Who's this guy showing up on my Zoom window after hours and talking about things that go back to the 1969 and Woodstock era of radical love? And let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in a place like this, where there were more people than roads, more creatures on the streets than cars, and it was a place where everything happened right out in the public, everything. And it was a tremendous moment for my upbringing until my first decade was essentially spent in an environment that really offered a means of understanding how human interactions, and including those with our biophysical surroundings as well as our built environment, really shape a lot of the way that we see the world. And for me, that took an example of coming home, for example, as a 7-year-old from second standard, as it was called in India, South India, town of Bangalore, to watch my mother being accosted by a group of naughty monkeys that had broken into our house, our apartment building, and on the balcony found a way to open the window, come into the house. And then as my mom was cleaning up some things, basically accost her and rummage through the cabinetry and get all the food they could. And I, coming home from school, seeing all of this, it was a moment of real reckoning with nature. And this was nature kind of open, unbridled, just very much in your face. And getting a dose of that was a early awakening for me in recognizing that we're working in an environment, or we're living in an environment that is constantly interacting with not only the local experiences that we have, but also some bigger scale things of the trees around us that enabled the monkeys to climb up to our balcony, that allowed all of this to happen. And so this was a constant, very porous interaction with the jungle, the jungle that was in the city, the creatures that were all around us. And it really kind of awakened me to a way of living that, as my parents pulled me from my friends and family, and I soon inherited the term and became an immigrant to the United States, I learned a lot about different ways in which nature and humans interact. And that really came in the form of my first apartment in Santa Rosa, California, where I was able to grab this Google image, which in a sense looks very much like I remember it as a child of 10 years old, living in this little place with a sycamore tree in the back. And really trying to find ways around a whole different landscape and negotiating my way through a landscape that didn't have monkeys, that didn't have a lot of the experiences that I held really close as a way to live in this world. And so the only reason I really want to bring up that kind of story in this conversation about nature and Portland and beyond is to just suggest to you that I've been thinking about constantly comparing systems of cohabitation and systems of governance and systems of nature interaction with humans. And this has been kind of not only a professional um, aspect of my life, it's actually been deeply a personal aspect of my life, as it's really affected the way that I see the world. And in more recent form, it's come in the way of looking at landscapes, and the landscapes that we have constantly and actively worked around. In this image here, I love looking at landscapes from above and from below. Though from this one from above, what we're seeing is just a simple road on the right here. And believe it or not, a road that's actually about the same distance from the side of the image on the left. And one has an enormous tree canopy on the left here, and the other one has a very limited tree canopy on the right. And these are the same, these are within the same city block, right? So we can see that a group of homes on the left side of the screen has a very different interaction with a biophysical environment than the homes on the right. And this is within one city block. Though you go a couple of blocks away and we see a totally different image where we see not only very few trees altogether across these city blocks, we also see very different housing, very different ways in which humans are inhabiting this space. And this, in my privilege of being able to walk around cities around the world, my professional life, I've been able to just gather more experiences about what it means to live in very different places, as I imagine you all have. And so what I really brought this into is a professional study of landscapes. And so really what I characterize myself as is really a landscape ecologist that has a real hankering for social justice. And that is kind of where most of my professional training has been. And I've tried to turn that now into a profession which I'm trying to dig deeper into the roots of these distributions of trees, of greenery, and of homes and cities, which has brought me to 82nd Avenue, Southeast 82nd Avenue, just down the street from where I live, is one of those places that is a very classic built environment in the United States. I grew up on a street that looked a lot like 82nd Avenue. This is a little bit of a dated image. Nevertheless, it still resembles much of what we see on 82nd Avenue in Southeast Portland. And what is obvious to me is the complete and utter owning of the space for vehicles and for infrastructure to move information, meaning these telephone wires and these internet wires that are all over. So we've essentially created these landscapes to prioritize what we see as important. And so a lot of the comparisons that I do in my work is to try to understand through the built environment, through the manifestation of specific objects on the environment, what a community has prioritized and what has been considered in the development and the creation of this landscape. And that's really at the core of where some of the personal interests that I have in this work have really manifest. And so when I think about this in terms of everyday experiences, a person walking in an environment that is got a large sidewalk with a utility pole, maybe some trees scattered here and there, maybe some closed businesses like you'd see on the left, as opposed to somebody walking on a smaller sidewalk with large form trees and various greenery around. These are very different everyday experiences when someone has to walk to the bus stop or move around their neighborhood, many of whom may not be able to use a car to get from place to place, or and have to rely on either rolling or their feet to get from one place to another. And so this is where this everyday experience really brings up this fundamental question of what I mean by the term radical. We've talked a little bit about love, the foundations of love, and what I'd really want to suggest to you is that radical, in this sense, is about love where we're centering all those, human and otherwise, who are systematically left out of socially constructed decision-making processes. And that is, in a sense, to say, and I want to just kind of unpack this a little bit more. The social construction is really about involving or considering women, houseless folk, folk in prison, in hospitals, physically challenged, older adults, children, too busy folk, Black folk, Latin folk, Indigenous folk, Asian folk, Pacific Islander folk, Middle Eastern folk, African folk, blind and or deaf folk, immigrants, LGBTQ folk, chronically hungry folk, non-English speaking folk, economically challenged folk, folk without high school or college education, unemployed, the biosphere, the birds, the trees, and all those who have yet to inhabit the earth. So this is fundamentally, for me, an encapsulation of those communities that have been systematically not directly involved in a lot of the social and decision-making processes that we've created for deciding what is prioritized in our landscapes. And so radical in this sense is to center those who have been excluded. And I'll come back to this in a minute. And I want to just provide an illustrative example because this may seem mundane to a lot of us, including me as before I started looking a little more closely at this. And what I'm wanting to kind of put that right up next to is a paper that came out last year in the journal Nature Communications, which essentially took 540 North American cities and created these things called climate analogs. Is what is the city going to look like based on climate models at about 2080 to 2100? And Portland was immediately identified as being much more similar to Sacramento in terms of the length of the summers, being much hotter, much longer, limited, a lot less continuous rain, and similar for these other 540 cities. And to me, this was like a really compelling way to represent what we might be talking about in the coming years, because we had been for the last decade going around and looking at one aspect of this massive transformation that's happening in front of us as we speak. And that is this issue of temperatures and the longer durations of summer that we're having, the hotter summers that we're having here in the region. And we've been driving around, as many of you might know, collecting, using very sensitive temperature sensing systems, temperature readings all around the region. And we've done this now for a bunch of cities. And part of what we're doing is taking those temperature sensors, working with community-based organizations, and then creating a series of maps that we work with community-based organizations to interpret, understand, and get a better handle on why we might be seeing what we're seeing. And so over the course of the day, we see that the red areas hotter, the blue areas cooler, vary by quite a bit. In this case, upwards of about almost 11 degrees or 12 degrees in the evening from Foster Boulevard to Tabor, for example. Just a few miles away, we see almost 15-degree Fahrenheit difference at the same time. And that helps us recognize of what's going on in these areas to produce these really interesting differences across a region, and layer on top of that who's living in these locations. And we see, at least for the Portland region, that the hottest parts of the region are where people with less formal education, limited English proficiency, neighborhoods that have higher racial diversity, extreme poverty, with less access to air conditioning, and then Asian and older adults live in those places. So were any of these people who live in these locations involved in decision-making processes about where the freeways go, about where the parks go, about where the big box stores go? And that's really a fundamental question when we're talking about the distributional effects of air temperature in this case. Though we've done this now in a whole bunch of other cities, and the pattern was really interesting because we were finding very similar results in lots of different places. So in Portland, one of the things that we were scratching our heads about is why we were seeing these patterns. And it didn't occur to us right away because I was asking my colleagues around the country saying, hey, what's up with this? We're seeing this pattern in Portland. We're seeing this pattern in Baltimore. We're seeing this pattern in Washington, D.C. We're seeing this pattern in Albuquerque and Tacoma. And part of what ended up emerging for us was that people would immediately say, oh, it's the luxury effect. People who have more money, they plant trees, they're able to take care of their neighborhoods. And it was this notion that, wealth brought the cooler temperatures. And it just seemed really unsatisfactory. And it wasn't really something that I was comfortable with because it was really associating it to an individual action. And we had a hunch there was something more systematic. So we started looking at these maps that were created in the 1930s called red line maps. And we started thinking about the distribution of heat in Portland and why we were seeing this and why we were seeing the areas that weren't as hot. And what ended up happening is when we looked at 108 cities, we were able to take these maps and start looking across the country at what the temperatures were based on satellite imagery and where the heat was. And before I get to that, I just want to read you a few of the characteristics of what were written in these red line maps. Remember, this is from the 1930s. This is part of a federal homeowners loan corporation that codified race-based planning. And so what we were looking into was, what does it say in these maps? Why were these areas designated red? And boy, if you have a moment, I would encourage you to go check out the Mapping Inequality website at the University of Richmond, because as a Monday evening reading moment during a non-happy hour time, you might want to go just take a look at some of these statements, because for Portland, we see things like in the D4 area, we see statements like, there are several Negro families, 3 known, who own property and live in this area. This constitutes a sufficient hazard to justify 4th grade rating, right? So this is a very idiosyncratic, often very local information, survey work done at a highly detailed level. And then C6, the particular hazard in the area is racial. There being a large percent of foreign-born, including a number of Oriental families and many Russians and Finns. This was at one time a highly respected neighborhood, but for the racial situation would be classed a low yellow. So the idea here is to really figure out who's living there, and then even delineate individual streets. Portland doesn't have much of these, but you look at St. Louis or Minneapolis, and they're individual roads where this language is identifying specific households that have lived there. And so we brought in this whole set of data. For over 200 were digitized, these maps, and we looked at them across the country. And as what we were finding is that they were consistently in the hottest places across the country, like these D neighborhoods. So if you look at the green here as A, the blue B, the yellow C, and the D being red, these were what were called homeowners loan corporation grades or ratings. And the A was considered the best, quote, and the D was considered, quote, hazardous. And C was definitely declining, and B was still desirable. And what we were finding in all of these places is a very consistent land use pattern. We were finding that greater amounts of asphalt and pavement were in the D areas. Highway projects and big box stores were in the D areas. Large scale housing project happened in the D and C areas. Industrial facilities were immediately adjacent to the areas, the C and D areas. And then they lacked large parks and green space, which was further corroborated by looking at satellite image that showed that impervious surface and tree canopy was a clear pattern across 108 cities that we saw in the country. And this was far more satisfying for us because in part, this was suggesting a very systematic pattern of housing people and putting industries adjacent to some of those locations. So this got us really deeper into this whole conversation, and we're gonna probably spend the next decade looking at this in more detail. Though some students in a class that I taught last academic year, looked at, as part of the Cleaner Air Oregon project, we had to, the industries in the state had to describe how much they were polluting. And so we geocoded that and just wanted to use the same ABCD rating to see what was going on here in terms of the number of industrial polluters adjacent to some of these, because we wanted to see if this was really true at the local level. And we were finding that, at least in terms of our analysis, that 38% of people of color in Portland are living within 2 kilometers of the top 10 industrial polluters. 42% of C and D red line grades are within 1 kilometer, and that 35% of 35% of total emissions are among the top 10 industrial polluters. So this got us to thinking, wow, so not only do we have heat, we have more pollution. And now, as we're seeing with the pandemic play out, the communities and news, in fact, today about the at least White House not being able to curb emissions on industrial pollutants is a direct fly in the face of some of these concerns that we identified in terms of the pollutants adjacent to redlined and C and D areas here in the Portland metro region. So this really is last set of at least graphs for a Monday night that I will show you. Promise they're only pretty pictures from now on. We wanted to look at change. What's happened more recently? Something that happened in 1930 couldn't be continuing to happen now because those systems are completely changed, right? We have done away with redlining. We have, with the Fair Housing Act of 1968, we have done away with all kinds of race-based planning. But yet here we look at population change from 1980 to 2016. And in Oakland, the A, B, C, D areas, the D areas end up getting the highest population change, with the A areas not seeing very much at all. That was similar pattern that we saw in Los Angeles, similar pattern we saw in Berkeley, similar pattern in Sacramento, and it's a similar pattern here in Portland, where the C and D areas were the largest, with an interesting rise, about 10%. Those are percentages, not 0.1%. It's actually 10%, excuse the typo there. And so what we're noticing is, yes, housing and the growth of housing in these areas could be a good thing, though it could be a gentrification issue. We're terming this as kind of a permissive landscape issue, where it turns out when a big development is happening, they're still being pushed over to D and C and D areas and not to any of the other areas, at least as receiving some of these new developments. And so again, we're kind of back to the system of what is it that's happening. And here's a classic example of a C area in Northeast Portland, where if you were to see a multifamily residential complex much like this with a bunch of trees and green space adjacent to it, what we often see is a cookie cutter approach, where we're essentially building the exact same thing. This is just a replica or a model of building the exact same thing just next to it. And so we see this kind of often very classic cookie cutter approach playing out all around the region still. And it's got us really wondering about, what does this mean in terms of Portland's future, as we're seeing amplifying temperatures and longer, hotter summers. And so here's where we kind of run into this challenge. And I want to kind of pivot the conversation as I close out here with my remarks in thinking about this. Yes, we have a massive shift in climate that's happening right now. That's on one side. And people are saying, listen, we only have 10 years. We have to act on this. And yet on the other side, we have a really interesting phenomenon where we have systemic biases that are affecting. This is taken from a recent paper that was published by Chris Schell, who's up at University of Washington, Tacoma, soon to be at Berkeley, and working out a conceptual model where we're essentially saying that these systemic biases are leading to the current distribution of heat, of pollutants, of, in Chris's case, ecological and evolutionary patterns and processes as an evolutionary biologist. What I really liked about this paper also is that it was bringing up the kind of parallel and not so consistent track between the social justice movement, which has really been about equitable redistribution of resources, and environmental justice movement, which is really about ecosystem services and ways in which their distributional, institutional, and procedural effects are not quite being equally and equitably felt or absorbed, at least in terms of ecosystem services. So we have this kind of competing narrative right now. We have to hurry, yet we have a set of systems that are in place that are really requiring us to move at the speed of trust, which is a phrase I've been kind of leaning into a little bit recently, because it really is fundamentally about how do we transition this conversation and bring everybody along with for this conversation about nature, climate change, and human habitation. And so that trifecta really gets far more interesting when we're talking about a socially constructed landscape. Just for the sake of conversation, I just wanted to throw this up here in terms of where we are right now in terms of temperatures across a city, right in the middle. And we modeled out what it would be like if we removed all the green in the city and expanded the asphalt in the city, just for an extreme case. And then what would happen if we modeled this out with cooling strategies, such as green spaces, parks, trees, and well maintained at that. And what we're seeing is that this cooling strategy was about 9 degrees cooler than the base case, meaning right now, whereas the extreme case of removing the green and asphalt increased it by 12 degrees. Keep in mind, this is Celsius. So overall, we have over 20-degree Celsius difference, which is upwards of 30 plus degrees in terms of Fahrenheit difference between the cooling strategy and the asphalt. And these are socially constructed landscapes that we have a lot of opportunity to, from a land use planning, from a parks and recreation, from a Bureau of Environmental Services, from a metro, from a planning and sustainability, et cetera, bureaus, we have a lot of opportunity to really address this. So as I round this out and come to my final set of at least visuals here, a lot of what's being proposed right now is really consistent with the climate change mitigation and adaptation literature when we're talking about biodiversity as being a fundamental means by which human health and well-being is supported. And so a lot of that is done through a concept called nature-based solutions, and we're really thinking about how do we bring these nature-based solutions to address the climate crisis and to simultaneously expand the opportunity for green spaces and nature to become a consistent and direct part of our city landscape. I have a set of principles here that I just want to maybe go through. I don't want to belabor this too much, but I think this is something that you all might be already familiar with, but let me just go through this just for the sake of conversation. The idea of embracing nature conservation norms, that is really finding ways to maintain what we already have, and really thinking about that existing set of green spaces, often those what I've been calling magnanimous megaflora, or across the region. Nature-based solutions can be implemented alone or simultaneously with other challenges. It's site-specific, and it includes, this is the important part, traditional, local, and scientific knowledge. The notion of being able to bring in indigenous knowledge into this as a regenerative landscape is really critical in trying to identify applications. The idea of creating fair and equitable distribution of benefits, and of course, maintaining biological and cultural diversity within this. And a couple more applying at the landscape level. And this is something I've been working at for some time, but the way our legal and planning system is set up is it's fee simple for individual parcels. And that really balks against a lot of the importance of thinking about green spaces, because green spaces really work across landscapes to really have to address biodiversity and all the support that it provides. And then of course, identifying the trade-offs where we want to think about immediate economic benefits, though we also want to think about the full range of ecosystem services that are available. And finally, thinking about overall design of policies and measures to address a specific challenge. So how do we get nature-based solutions as an integral part of the decision-making framework by including those who have been systematically left out of the process? I would just want to leave you with the idea that, nature in cities is not a new concept by any means. In fact, one would argue that this is essentially where we were born. Evolutionarily as a species, we have found ways to tell stories about nature in cities, and it's often come in the form of different forms of trees. Wherever you look across the world, you'll find ways in which humans have found ways to describe the different meaning of different forms of trees. And I think the culture and the storytelling dimension of this is not to be underestimated. We spent a lot of time in the scientific assessments, though, these complement really well with what we are talking about in terms of science with tradition, in tradition of storytelling fundamentally as being part of this. And we don't have to look far for any of these stories. They're really quite abundant in terms of what we can draw on. So finally, why radical? Three definitions of radical. The first is of or growing from the root, right? And that, in this context, the notion using that definition in this context really means about radical transformation of the racist roots of urban nature. So I would want to ask you all, in what ways do these roots, these racist roots, constrain your daily work? How do you actually check that in your daily work? And what is the work you need to do, whether it's emotional labor on your part or whether it's actually actively working within the system that you are finding yourself? A second definition of radical comes up as different from the usual or traditional. And for that, I would suggest that democracy and our current systems are centered around voices, yet those with the most resources are often the loudest. So how can you uplift unheard voices in this process? And then finally, radical also means favoring extreme changes in existing views, habits, conditions, or institutions. And I would want to ask you, to what extent can you create systems of governments that dismantle inequities, many of which we've spoken about today? So with that, I want to leave you with this and stop sharing my screen and really look forward to having a conversation with you for the next 20-ish, 25 minutes, if not longer.
Thanks, Vivek.
Sure.
Awesome presentation. So I'm curious, a lot of what you're saying obviously resonates for many different reasons. But it also strikes me as a considerable departure from the narrative of Portland. You know, I was looking back and thinking about when I first moved here in 1990, and the narrative of Portland and the region was really about the urban growth boundary and the preservation of farm and, you know, forest and natural spaces and constraining, you know, the city. And if you know, scan or just Google urban growth boundary and images, you come up with all of these you know, images of density, exactly the kinds of things that you showed as bad examples, you know, that are sort of against nature. And I'm wondering how these two narratives, you know, meet at this point in time. It seems like we don't actually hear that much about maintaining the urban growth boundary like we once did. Instead, and rightly so, we hear a great deal about environmental justice and the need, you know, for nature and, you know, urban cooling effect and all of this. And I'm kind of curious where these two things meet, because it seems at a certain point, at least on a policy level and in the sort of crude instruments of planning that we have, that there has to be an adjustment. And I'm curious where you see those adjustments happening.
Right, that's a profound question. Wish we had a lot more time with it, but I just my thought is I think there's so much we know about the challenging processes that have been developed, or the challenges or bottlenecks of the processes we've developed for decision making. So the question of density, I think we need. I mean, we're in this housing challenge where we need more units on the ground, and at the same time, we also are recognizing that we're saying we don't need to worry about a greenery or conserving green space when we're putting in affordable housing, and which also suggests that we don't really care whether communities who live in affordable housing have access to green space, clean air, cooler temperatures, etc. And so this kind of challenges often, I think, comes down to how we've thought about development. And I think the way we think about development often tends to be relatively blunt still. It's essentially clearing the land, you know, raising it, packing the soil down as hard as you can, and putting up your unit, often lot edge to lot edge. And so part of what I think we're really needing to think about interventions is what are the ways we use the mechanisms we have to bring from a physical planning point of view, to think about and redesigning the processes of what we consider important in the redevelopment process, and bringing those directly with along with developers to figure out what are the designs that would work best for affordable housing that also includes green space. We did a couple of modeling exercises, strictly again physical, to look at the relationship between going from 16 units to 64 units of density on a city block, and whether we could actually keep temperatures at the same level as they were during the 16 unit scenario. And we were able to do it, at least from a computational computer modeling point of view. So we have suggestions, at least, that we can move in that direction. And I don't think this pitting one against the other conversation is really productive for us to be having. And it's kind of like saying, is it the economy and jobs, or is it climate change? Is it addressing climate change? It's such an artificial dichotomy that really pits us up against just an unnecessary duality that really doesn't need to be part of the conversation. And so I do think it's an important conversation to have, but I think we need to dispel the kind of bifurcation of the two choices that we have, which is, I think, largely driven by a market mentality.
I'm curious if the computer models, looked at cost of building, because that's obviously a huge, component. Even for a nonprofit developer, you still have to, a 2x4 costs what a 2x4 costs, and,
Right.
and you still have to hit an economy of scale in order to provide the housing.
Yeah, that's a piece that's not part of this model. At the same time, the development itself is less about um, necessarily changing anything about the actual development than the actual form of the development. So we weren't even digging. When we constructed this, we weren't even tucking parking underneath. We weren't creating an underground garage or anything like that. We were creating a very developments like we've seen in many parts of the world. It wouldn't be recreating an entirely new form of development. And so that's at least one thought I have. A quick side of that is just that the process of involving communities in the greening has also been over, in many ways, at least my observation is it's been relatively undervalued in the process. And often what we see is, a developer and a city basically negotiating on what this land will look like, and the process of what a community experiences when a change occurs is either relegated to the side, left apart from the conversation, or not in any way really instrumental to what that ultimate design looks like. And I think we have a really amazing opportunity right now with this climate crisis and with a lot of need for housing to engage communities, because often the communities really know, and I continue to believe the communities really know what's best for the neighborhood and for the city block as a whole.
We talked a little bit about this in our pre-conversation, but the trade-offs that exist. Our mutual friend Gil Kelly in Vancouver, BC, attempting to implement passive house standards for new buildings there, which it's a sort of European-based system of energy efficient design that's quite expensive per square foot to build. And every time you put a corner in it, it makes it even more expensive because you're really creating a tight envelope. And they're trying to balance that against their own efforts to preserve urban, greenery, there, because, basically trying to preserve an existing tree usually means adding more corners to a building. And how do you think we can determine how do we create a new system of weighing these different issues, differently than we have?
Yeah, you don't take easy. You don't present easy questions, Randy. That's clear. I mean, part of this is about fundamentally the priorities that we want to see play out. I mean, I really see this as we're using a system that has commodified everything from the physical land to the materials to the trees themselves. And part of this commodification of all of these systems has created a system where you're actually trading off constantly between the short-term economic gains and the long-term potential benefits. And if you're going to tell me it costs more to build a structure in the short term, and that's really not that's not able to pencil out for this particular development, I'll tell you that let's bring in all the costs that we're really talking about when we're leaving out all of this potential green space. We've quantified a lot of that, and we found that the costs, if you take it over, it's just a matter of time. You take those costs out a little bit farther, and you're going to see the health impacts on a community that will far outweigh the incremental increases in the design considerations for the city of Vancouver. I mean, that we've come to pretty good, at least economic understanding of. And so whether we're going to prioritize that short-term challenge of I can't quite get somebody to agree to this short-term economic blow because of what it's going to cost to redesign and rethink this, I'll just say, well, let's just think about what the time frame is around what we're calculating this around. And that's a little evasive, I guess, but I do also think that it's also the perspective you want to take to it is, short versus long. And I'm going to be a long-term advocate for the long view.
Yeah, we should do one of these conversations with even one of our more progressive developers and sometime. It would be quite interesting.
Sure.
I'm curious in beaming back. I mean, we just completed Portland just completed a comp plan, and we didn't talk about this in the pre-question, so I'm tossing this out on the table. Do you have critiques of what could have been done better?
Oh boy, that's another doozy. I mean, I guess I'd go back to that old adage that, plans, what is it? Was it Churchill? I forget who said this, but it's like, plans are helpful. Planning is everything, right? The idea of like the execution of this. We have an idea, we have a vision, and we're going to move towards it. Who we engage in enacting that vision, how we engage them in that process, the extent to which long-term perspectives are brought into that vision, and the orchestration and implementation of that vision. That to me is everything, and that requires a long-term commitment, lots of trust, and engaged civic participation, and an ongoing ability to know what the outcomes of decisions might look like. And so the modeling side of stuff we've done a ton of, but this whole process of how you're executing it in a way that allows it to really address some of the historic inequities, that's everything in my book. So ultimately, we want to be really thinking about the execution of that comprehensive plan. And I think, planning bureaus and all the other bureaus that were involved in this, I think it's an essential step to being able to create some form of agreement across the community. And now let's do it well. Fundamentally, I can nitpick it for a long time, but I mean that's not why I think we're here. We want to kind of keep the conversation hopefully elevated at a higher level, but I'm happy to also nitpick if you'd like.
So you, as chair of the Urban Forestry Commission, you have gotten to see, sort of firsthand knowledge of the, sausage making of government. And I'm curious what have been the lessons that you've taken away from that experience thus far. Where do you find that your academic theories and sort of models and stuff have been most tested? Where have you had to grow in order to deal with the politics of the situations?
Yeah, I mean, it's really got me rethinking a lot about the academic writing process and the extent to which any papers are actually making a dent in the questions that decision makers are asking. And part of where a lot of the work, at least with the Institute of Sustainable Solutions and other groups like it, are really oriented is around the notion of user-inspired research and things like that, where you really don't want to construct the models and research and all in the ivory tower, detached from the world, detached from, and I'm really grateful for PSU to actually offer that opening to say, you know, you can do this applied research, and it's an okay thing. Although the system of rewards and penalties are still relatively stacked against doing applied community-based research, I would argue, it still is better than other universities that I've seen. A, and B, it's just being able to attune into what is a city bureau manager asking. What are the trade-offs that they're trying to explore? And then in our own world, being able to bring that back, sort it out with in terms of what we know about the trade-offs, what we don't, and really drawing that out. And so most of the work we've been doing has been really driven by the people who will most likely consume the research. So I mean, that's really where I hope universities go. And if I have any say in it, I'm really going to try to nudge in that direction as much as we can.
If you were sort of unbound by the university and unbound by being on the Urban Forestry Commission, and could just sort of for a moment apply the knowledge that you've picked up in both of these circumstances to, let's say, a neighborhood or a city plan or whatever is in your imagination, what would you do if you were sort of could do anything you wanted right now?
Yeah, I would really start with the community, for the community, by the community. Like I would love to go out there. I mean, nowadays getting out and doing, we have a project funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that's all about using a community-based participatory research model. And it's really hard right now because the communities we're working with and the community-based organizations we're working with are overextended. They have limited staff and they have way more expectation of projects that they're already committed to. And so what I'd love to do is build the capacity for community-based organizations to be able to engage their constituencies in asking the questions around what are the current needs of the community? Because frankly, if we go in planting a bunch of trees in a neighborhood without working directly with the community, I think it's going to backfire in a way that we're not only going to lose resources in terms of those trees, potentially not surviving, but we're also going to piss off a bunch of people who might not have wanted those trees there. And so this is it's a delicate process I've come to appreciate around how do we build the capacity through engaging communities in the places that they are with the needs that they have, and then understanding the role that greening might play in that space. And if we kind of begin with the greening, then I think we're going to really be challenged in a sense of being able to get the receptivity, because there might be very different reactions to that particular place when someone's trying to get food on the table, someone's trying to figure out how they're going to get their kids taken care of during this pandemic, and there's very different needs that are at place before we even begin that greening conversation. So I would wave a magic wand and kind of build capacity at the local level with whether it be working through culturally based, community-based organizations, issue-specific organizations, and really trying to build the wealth and the capacity from the ground up.
Are there communities either in the States or elsewhere that that you feel are doing a particularly great job?
Yeah, it's interesting when I look around the world. I mean, I have two lenses I've often looked at my life through. One is the North American lens, and the other is the South Asian lens. And the two have very different systems, although both democratic societies. I will say that I've had the good fortune to work in places like Japan, got some insights into projects in China, and projects in the Middle East as well. And what I've noticed is in really vibrant democracies like in India, where you have an open and active debate about what's going on, the community is really activated. And folks like Vandana Shiva, who is one of my mentors, intellectual mentors, have just really been able to galvanize community interest in conservation in a way that I've seen very few other places do that. And so folks like Vandana Shiva, who can identify a specific challenge, engage communities to move into that challenge directly, directly confront that challenge, often driven by very powerful entities that might be at play, or folks like Francis and Maura LePay, who are saying, hey, it's not about the amount of food we have, it's about the systems that have gone about its distribution. And so what can we do about changing that system to distribute that more equitably? Similar thing with greening. And what can we do in terms of galvanizing communities to be able to act on a specific topic? In this case, we would be, so to get at your question, I guess fundamentally it's the communities that I've seen, like the Chipko movement in India, for example, incredibly engaged movement and still active today, still incredibly involved in terms of addressing some of the, at least nature in cities and nature more generally questions that have come up, at least in this conversation.
Portland's had a lot of its myths punctured in the last few years. Are there any others that you feel are holding us back that maybe need a pinprick or two?
Wait, say it again. So,
I think there's been a sort of complacency and self-satisfaction in Portland that has been, dramatically punctured by the racial justice movement, and that's been building for a number of years. But a lot of the, so-called innovations, were in many ways innovations that we were, looked to by many other communities, streetcars and, the Pearl District and, light rail, all of those things, were pretty much produced by, a dominant, white majority. The city was not, during the 70s when we sort of got started with all of these urban innovations, we were not dealing with the same kinds of racial issues that other cities were. It was more like a European country. And that's all been called out in a major way in the last, 5 to 10 years. But do you feel like there are other sort of mythologies, self-satisfactions that we need to examine?
Yeah, I mean, where do I start? There's so many. Like, I mean, I could just go through the list. The involvement of folks who have been largely kind of put to the side. Like we have like the American Disability Act. This is the year of the 30th anniversary of the American Disability Act. I'm still today seeing kind of curb cuts just start in my neighborhood, and it's like, oh my goodness, was nobody was thinking about this over the last 30 years? Where was that? Like, how can we still be working out curb cuts for people on wheels to be able to get from one house to another? Like that seems so funny to me in many ways. The idea of, coming to Portland, I mean, this may be related to what you're saying, but when I first arrived in Portland, it's like, oh yeah, I heard this so many times when I first came to Portland in 1994, and then later in 2005, it was like, yeah, we don't see color here. We're all just get along and we just work together really well. And I was just scratching my head. I'm like, do you know what I've gone through my life of being called out because of the color of my skin and nothing other than that? And you're telling me you're colorblind? Do you have a sense for kind of how much privilege you're coming to me with with that phrase? And so there are things like that that have been consistently surprising to me. The biking culture, the fact that men are biking so much more than women. Like that's a very big difference, and the fear factor around how we're creating roads that are a little bit more bike friendly for those who might be a little more timid on a bike. Like, how do we actually think about designing bike lanes, bike spaces for those who might be a little bit more scared than me when I get on my race bike and start zooming down the street fearlessly? Like that is something I would be really interested in digging into or getting a better handle on. And of course, I mean, the whole issue, I don't want to start on, but the whole issue of kind of East Portland and how it's been largely just left behind, whereas the image of Portland has largely been, 39 Cesar Chavez and West. And it's like, yeah, let's think about the city as a whole and bring in the majority of the city, which was, redlined and C and D neighborhoods that were often on the other side of Portland. So yeah, I can go on there.
Yeah.
There's a lot there.
No, it's interesting to think that the 82nd is actually closer to the geographic center of the city.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. And the land use patterns are so different. I mean, farmland that was brought in and gradually suburbanized first, and now we're sort of ham-handedly trying to urbanize it. Presents some really interesting dilemmas. What's giving you hope, both locally and more broadly speaking? Maybe like some really specific things that have happened that are really buoying you.
I mean, the biggest wind in my sail, without question, is PSEF. Like Portland Clean Energy Fund, that was like nothing else. Nobody could have imagined the groundswell of interest on that. And I was really compelled to see other cities starting to take a similar approach around the country with PSEF. And it's an example of how a community really driven, largely a community driven effort can bring resources and address some of the historic inequities without involving a lot of the, I think, historic or at least traditional decision-making processes that cities have been largely in charge of. And so while the city is the administrative home of PSEF, it still lends itself to money going into a community and flowing in that direction, because it has been concentrated in specific set of silos for so long. And this is an opportunity to really move those resources into a place where we can weatherize and we can think about greening and urban agriculture and various other climate strategies, nature-based solutions that we were talking about earlier. So that's without question one of the biggest hopes I have right now.
Excellent. Is there anything that you would like to talk about that I haven't asked you? I don't know how closely you've been following the chat. I've sort of generally tried to hit some of those issues as they've streamed by.
Yeah, I can see I've already offended a few people, and that's okay. In my rapid fire to your questions, I think I might have, I don't know, said things that have provoked. But then again, that's kind of why we're here for happy hour. I'm not on the clock, so to speak. But yeah, I'm boy, there's so many. Any that jump out for you, Randy?
Well, there's some specific things about whether like native trees are going to be added to the allowable, to the Portland street tree list. That's been a longstanding issue. I guess maybe broadly, it's like what's next for the Urban Forestry Commission? What are some policy issues that you're hoping to bring forward and see solved in some way, or at least move forward?
Um, I mean, a few things we're watching is there's a streets 2035 issue that's playing out right now. That's needless to say something about how we design our streets and what we can accommodate, because the little stretch of sidewalk, which COVID has made very abundantly clear, sidewalks, how skinny they are. It's really brought up like, what does that real estate of sidewalk really mean for a city? And how do we think about making space for the green things that we want to see in our city. So the Streets 2035 and the role that trees play in that, I think will be a really interesting piece for us to think about. The commissioners are so, I'm at least hearing, I'm but a voice on the commission, and I'm hearing so much of interest around climate change, and I think we're really trying to figure out where that best fits. The levy that you were so involved with, and Portland Parks Foundation was so involved with. I mean, the language in it is broad enough to be able to really think about, for me, what does that mean for supporting historically disinvested communities in addressing addressing some of the issues of climate change. And the levy has language for specifically addressing inequities, historic inequities. So I'm really excited about what the commissioners might say for how to characterize and how to support the equity discussion. There's the piece we've been working on for a really long time around street trees, and I saw a couple of comments on this. It's unfortunate that we are encouraging a greening of a city, though putting the cost of the maintenance of the adjacent street tree on the property owner, or and in rental situations, that's on not on the renter, but on that property owner itself. So trying to think about how do we find systems, because the levee isn't designed to necessarily provide maintenance for street trees that are planted in those locations. It didn't poll well, from what I understand.
Yeah, that was true. Yeah, it was examined, but it felt the polling was bad enough that it would potentially drag the whole levy down.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of, I mean, we sort of pondered like, why is that? And pretty much kind of came up with it. Most people just think that street trees should be maintained by owners rather than thinking of it as public infrastructure. And so there
Right.
seems like
Right.
there's a lot of education to do around that idea, and to get people to buy into it.
Right. Right.
Um, well, a very simple question to perhaps end on, which is what can the average individual do to advance some of the ideas that we've talked about tonight? What would be one thing you would tell a good friend who wanted to get involved to do?
Yeah, I mean, I've just found that supporting organizations. I mean, I'm a big fan for supporting organizations that are attempting to address. I mean, whether it be the Black Resilience Fund, or whether it be organizations that are actively trying to redistribute resources, particularly to those who have been hardest hit by the pandemic, particularly those who have been historically disinvested over, not of any choice of their own, but fact that there are active and clear efforts, whether it be at the federal level, particularly, that are reducing the availability of resources for some communities. And so right now, I think as we go into winter, as we're thinking about kind of some basic needs for heating homes and things like that, like, we don't have, aside from Energy Trust and other programs, we don't have a lot of really good weatherization programs, and people are paying enormous amounts for energy bills and deciding between, do I keep the house warm or do I feed my kids? And providing resources to organizations that can then redistribute that out to communities, I think is a really, for me, that's my first go-to. Like, where can I look to? I mean, I have a good privilege of having a couple of jobs, so that allows me to at least be able to bring resources out to a community. Um, we work with a lot of folks. We work with Verde. We work with, at least locally, work with Verde, Apano, Wisdom of the Elders. I don't want to make. I don't necessarily want to just call these out, because it'll just feel like I'm not not calling out the other organizations. And tonight at 3 a.m. when I'm sleeping, I'll be like, oh, I wish I said these other organizations. But Black United Fund, Black Resilience Fund. So many. Oh my goodness, so many. I don't think we could. And there's lots of places, resources to be able to identify these organizations, identify their specific constituencies, as well as where the money goes and things like that. So yeah.
Well, with that, I can't think of a better place to end. And those of us with privilege need to do our homework and figure out the best place to, help those who don't have it. I want to thank the folks who tuned in tonight, and particularly those who did take the option of giving us a little money to present these. It really helps the foundation out a lot, and we'll keep doing these. We're going to hopefully early in the year release a new series of programs in February. Probably March is going to be more realistic. The theme of which is going to be spatial justice, as we kind of look to rethinking our downtown, and some of the activities that have happened there, and who downtown is for, and who it can be for. And so keep an eye out for that. Meantime, thank you, Vivek Shandas, both for your knowledge, your hard work, and then also mainly your generosity of spirit. It just comes through and is inspiring, I think, to everyone. So thanks for spending part of your evening with us.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate the questions. I wish I could have gotten to more of them. Take care.
Okay.